Hello. Thank you for having me. I hope you're all safe and well. Excited to spend the next hour or so with you. Hopefully I'll end a little early so I can answer any questions if you have any. Although, as my students tell me, Mr. Dewar, you make my head hurt. I tend to pack a lot of information in a short amount of time. And no doubt you might feel a little dizzy after this. And if you do, I know I've done my job well. Quick little thing before we get going. Sometimes you give the impression, as someone who talks about mindfulness and stress management a lot, that somehow you have everything figured out. Disclaimer up front. I do not have everything figured out. Just moments ago, I was down in the kitchen with a 13-year-old who's trying to do online learning, who's chasing our two one-year-old golden retriever puppies around, getting them riled up. And I'm saying to my wife, I got to be on in just a couple minutes. You guys got to quiet down. And she looks at me and she says, aren't you about to give a presentation on stress management? And I was immediately humbled because we're all figuring this out in real time. So I do not speak from a privileged position. I am on the journey like all of you and trying to put into practice a lot of the ideas we're going to be talking about here over the next hour. So I want to start with a big picture view of stress before we get into some more specific strategies and techniques. And I think one of the issues that I've found in helping people in schools and in organizations more skillfully deal with stress is that one of the most unhelpful or unskillful things we can do is immediately try to jump to strategies, right? And it's because this is symptomatic of staying in problem-solving mode. And this is one of the issues with educators is we're so used to putting out fires that we sometimes don't realize that the biggest problem, the biggest stressor is forever being in problem-solving mode. And that sometimes it's our orientation to things in general that needs to be reevaluated. Sometimes we need to skillfully disengage, step back, and entertain a bigger picture of the situation and the circumstances that we're in. And when we do that, when we shift our orientation, often we have then the freedom to choose how it is we're going to apply different strategies and techniques. And we can do so more intelligently. So let's start with the big picture of stress. Let's take a moment, and I want you to imagine two doors. Behind door number one is a life of health, happiness, and personal growth. Behind door number two is a life of sickness, sadness, and personal stagnation. And so my question for you is, which door would you choose? Which life would you choose? The life behind door number one or the life behind door number two? Sounds like a really stupid question, right? Of course you choose the life behind door number one, because no one deliberately sets out to live the life behind door number two. I sometimes teach a class called Wellness for Life with freshmen in high school. And I say, raise your hand if you don't want to be happy, healthy, and well. And I've taught this class, I don't know how many times. I've never had a student raise their hand. No one wants to not be happy, healthy, and well. And so the question then is, why are we statistically speaking more likely now, more than ever before, to end up living the life behind door number two? Right? No one sets out to live that life, and yet too many of us are finding ourselves behind door number two, even though we universally, innately want to live that life behind door number one. And the real culprit here is mismanaged stress. Because we don't know how to skillfully deal with stress, we end up behind door number two. We end up living the life behind door number two. And door number one just becomes some distant dream that we think we just made up and was never even possible, or something that's so far away that we just give up ever getting back to it. And so hopefully through the course of this presentation, we can figure out how to get back to door number one if we found ourselves behind door number two. And so this is really important. Our worst habits are unskillful attempts to manage stress. So if we stopped and we did a quick lifestyle inventory, we would quickly find that our most maladaptive behaviors are unskillful attempts to manage stress, and often unconscious behaviors as well. And to this end, there are so many statistics I could throw at you to support this, and we could go on for the next 5 hours just going over all the data on this. But there's one particular data point that I think is most interesting and compelling, and this is the one that I'll share. And this is from the CDC. A few years ago, they realized that the United States was the only first world country with a declining life expectancy. So they put together a team of researchers and they started looking into this. And it was confusing because somehow I hit the button. I can't go back. Okay, well, it was confusing because the typical culprits that affect life expectancy were starting to stabilize: heart disease, diabetes, dementia, etc. And so they put this team together, and what they found was what they called diseases of despair. And diseases of despair are 3 statistical categories: death by alcohol, death by drugs, and death by suicide. And what they found is that people in middle age were dying at an unprecedented rate. And they were dying from these diseases of despair. I think these are the stats from 2017. 88,000 alcohol-related deaths, which had more than doubled since 1999. 63,500 drug-related deaths, 2/3 of which are opioid-related. And 45,000 suicides, which is up 34% since 1999. And I believe that there are 10 states that had suicide rates that were up over 50% in that time frame. And so beyond the human cost and the emotional cost of the diseases of despair, there's also a significant economic cost that's approaching $1 trillion per year. $1 trillion. That's not billion, that's trillion with a T. There's an economist at Dartmouth, also David Blanchflower, who recently published an article about the peak age, or the age of peak unhappiness, and it's 47.2 years old. So he found that from 18 years old to 47 years, our unhappiness is climbing. And then after 47.2, we go back down. So if you're on the front end of that, I guess that's not good news. If 47 is in the rearview mirror, then good for you. It's all smooth sailing from here on out. But all kidding and joking aside, it's this time of life, 47, where we are most stressed out. We have our families, we have our careers, our jobs, we have all these things going on. And because we don't know how to skillfully manage stress, we're attempting to self-regulate through alcohol, through drugs, and ultimately, when these things don't work, people are taking their lives. And I know I know suicide's a more complex issue than what I'm presenting right here, more nuanced, but there is an element here that it becomes obviously the last resort to a life that is in a tremendous amount of pain. And as I previously said, our worst habits are unskillful attempts to manage stress. And here with diseases of despair, we see that we have some very unskillful self-regulating habits, and we're dying as a result of those habits. And somehow my screen is frozen. Here, I can't move my slides anymore. Oh, There we go. We're back. All right. So these unskillful responses are a dead end, literally and figuratively. And so what's the antidote? What can we do to turn this around? And I'm seeing comments pop up here, so I'm not sure if I'm supposed to check these out. Okay, sorry, guess not. I just see them keep popping up. I didn't know if there was something that I needed to know. So what's the antidote? And now I'm frozen again. Stress literacy is the antidote, increasing our ability to identify, understand, and skillfully respond to stressful internal states. And so this starts with acknowledging that there are two types of stress. Stress that leads to distress, dysfunction, disease, disability, and death. I call this the maladaptive stress cycle. And stress that leads to growth, adaptation, resilience, and transformation. And what the research shows is that the difference between these two forms of stress lies not in the stress itself, but in how skillfully we respond to it. So whether or not stress is a hindrance or an asset depends less on the stress itself and more on how we respond to it. And so where do we begin? How do we start transforming stress into skill? And I want to start with an analogy, because I don't think a lot of us fully appreciate what the experience of stress actually is from a lived experience standpoint. We all know what a metronome is. A metronome, you set it to a beat, and it's a fixed beat, a fixed cadence, tick, 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 right? Just like that. Well, inside each one of us, we have an internal state, right? Right now, you are aware of the world. And if I were to say, what's it like to be you right now? You would describe some sort of emotional internal state. And that emotional internal state has its own metronome, so to speak, its own rhythm, its own tick, okay? And so stress is when our internal metronome moves too fast or too slow for our environment. So this is a subtle point here. So when you wake up in the morning, so my wife and I, at the beginning and ends of the day, the beginnings and ends of the day, we tend to have different internal metronomes. So in the morning, I'm very alert and I'm going, and she's very slow. So my metronome is tick, 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 tick. And hers is tick, tick, tick. And at the end of the day, it's reversed. And so we noticed early on in our marriage that when we had conflict, we would tend to have conflict at the beginning of the day and the end of the day, right? No surprise, because for me, my internal metronome is ticking very fast. And so I perceive her is going so slow, and it's agitating, right? It's like being in a hurry and you get a stoplight or you're in traffic. Your internal metronome is tick, 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 and the traffic is tick, tick, tick. And so it's the incongruency of these two things that causes stress. Now, stress can also be caused when you're moving. So at night, her internal metronome is moving very quickly, and mine is moving very slowly. And so she's talking a mile a minute, and I'm practically drooling on myself because I'm so tired. And so I get frustrated. It seems like she's overbearing and everything's happening too fast, right? So stress is when our internal metronome is out of sync with the beat of the environment, okay? So this is just an analogy to understand what is called the window of tolerance. And this is from Dan Siegel's work, his book from 1999, where he explores the window of tolerance. And when our internal metronome matches the external metronome, and they're ticking in unison. This is when we're in the window of tolerance. This is when life is good. This is where we want to be. This is where our internal state feels harmonized. We're grounded, flexible, open, curious, present, and able to emotionally self-regulate. This is what neuroscientists call top-down regulation, when the newer parts of the human brain are effectively down-regulating and influencing the lower brain. And so when our internal metronome is going too fast for our environment, we move up into what's called hyperarousal. This is being overwhelmed. We have too much energy. It's burning us up. We're anxious, angry, overwhelmed, hypervigilant. Everything sets us off. This was me right before the presentation, 10 minutes before the presentation. I was down in the kitchen. Everyone's just living their Friday normally, but I'm all amped up because I knew I was going to be giving this presentation. So everything was irritating to me, the dogs, like everything going on. So this elicits lower brain activity when we move up into hyperarousal. And so when our internal metronome is too slow for our environment, we start to shut down. And so in the red is where we get anxiety, and in the blue here at the bottom is where we get depression. And depression is also very stressful. We start to shut down. We become numb, passive, withdrawn, freeze, etc. And so from a stress management and self-care standpoint, we want to start to design a lifestyle that expands our window of tolerance, that allows us to self-regulate and stay in that zone of regulation for as long as possible and as consistently as possible. And we also then want to learn specific techniques so that when we recognize we're moving into hyperarousal, our internal metronome is going too fast, or we're sliding into hypoarousal and our internal metronome is going too slow, that we start utilizing skillful strategies to come back up into this zone of regulation. So too fast, in sync, too slow is how we would organize that. So we want strategies to down-regulate, we want strategies to regulate, and we want strategies to up-regulate. So there are two approaches to doing this when we start looking at stress management strategies. There's stress prevention, which is to learn skillful behaviors that increase stress tolerance and maintain or widen the window of self-regulation. And then there's stress intervention. Learn skillful behavioral responses to stress that restore self-regulation once it's lost. So we're going to start with number one. And these are, this is the work that I do with my own school district, my own students, and educational colleagues in school districts all over. So stress prevention is huge. And this is really important. So pay attention to this. The best way to deal with stress, the most effective way to deal with stress is to stay ahead of it. Okay. Of course, we can't always do that. Life is inherently stressful, and there are things we cannot account for in advance. Totally understand, but let's put that aside. Nonetheless, the best way to deal with stress is to stay ahead of it. So I often talk about the well-being bank account, and we all have a well-being bank account, and we have to make regular self-care deposits in that bank account in order to pay our daily stress bills. And when we stop making self-care deposits, or we don't put ones in that can maintain the cost of our daily stress bills, a deficit opens up. And that deficit is stress. That deficit in our well-being account is stress. And so the greater the deficit, the greater the stress. And what ends up happening as the diseases of despair show is that for many of us, we get into debt or into a deficit in our well-being account. We start to lean on self-care loans. Things like, generally speaking, depressants and stimulants, right? These quickly adjust our internal state. The problem is after you've had a glass of wine or two or a bottle, are you any more equipped to deal with stress the next time you encounter it? No, you're not. And so, as with all loans, there's an interest rate, which means they become more costly over time. And so if you're drinking wine every night or taking some sort of a depressant to calm down, you're taking a self-care loan. And though it pays the bills in the moment, if day after day you keep taking these loans, you're just compounding the cost and you're displacing it to a later time. But here's the thing, you always have to pay your loans back. Your physiology never lies. Your biology never lies. At some point, your body's going to let you know the cost incurred. And so we have to be smart about these self-care loans. And it's not just depressants, it's also stimulants, right? Because sometimes we're too low and we need to come up. So every morning when you wake up and you feel like you're not ready for the day and you drink a lot of caffeine to get going, you're taking a self-care loan that's, again, compounding the cost to a later time. And so people often ask, what is the most important self-care deposit that I can make? What is the most bang for the buck? And research is showing in the last 5 to 10 years, the research on circadian science is that we have to set our circadian clocks. What's a circadian clock? Circadian means about 24. So the circadian rhythm that each one of us has is the rhythm of our biology. Every cell in our body runs on a 24-hour clock. What's amazing is not all of these clocks are not synced together. They have no ability to communicate to one another. And so what syncs every clock in your body on the same 24-hour clock is sunlight on the eyes and darkness on the eyes. And what the circadian rhythm through evolution what it's designed us to do is to be on a 24-hour clock. So it tells our body on a schedule when it needs to be alert and when it needs to be calm and tired. And you can point to almost any health issue, psychological or physical, and there is a circadian disruption element to it, is that we are so dysregulated in terms of our circadian clocks that it has a whole host of problems. I could do a whole very long presentation on this, right? And so how do we set our circadian clocks? How do we make sure that we're alert at the appropriate time of day and that we are tired at the appropriate time of day? Because for most of us, it's reversed. At the time of day when we're supposed to be awake, we're tired, the morning. And so what do? We take stimulants to wake up. We take a self-care loan, right? And then at the end of the day, when we should be tired and embracing rest, we're all agitated and anxious. And so we take depressants to come down. So our whole circadian cycle is reversed. Not good. And it creates a whole host of bad habits as a result to try to compensate and bring us back into that zone of regulation. So how do we set our circadian clock? Get natural light. This is the most important part. Get natural light around sunrise, no later than 9 a.m. After 9 a.m., you enter what's called a circadian dead zone, which means the angle of the light and the photon energy outside is not enough to program through your eyes your circadian clock. So the closer to sunrise, the better. This image that we have in the background here is wonderful because it shows the chromatic shift in light that happens at sunrise and sunset. At sunrise, it goes from blue or black to blue to yellow. And this registers this chromatic shift in color. It's all photons, light photons in your eyes. The melanopsin ganglion cells in your eyes register this, and they start to set your internal clock. So when you get light on your eyes in the morning, it sets a timer, a 16-hour timer for when you're going to get tired. So when you get up early and you get outside and you get natural light on your eyes, any time of year, you're setting your circadian clock. And within 3 or 4 days, you can set your clock of doing this. Then you want to get natural light again around sunset when the chromatic shift changes from yellow to blue to dark or black, right? And it's that same photon energy. It's cueing your brain. We're entering into night. We can start calming down. The stress hormones start going down. Melatonin, the sleep hormone, starts spiking and going up. And then equally important is that around 11 p.m. to 4 a.m. in the middle of the night, you don't want light on your eyes. If you do that, you're going to be resetting your clock. And this is what so many of us do with screens. And it's not just blue light. People think that blue light is the only culprit. And so they buy blue light glasses. And when they're on computers at night, blue light blocking glasses and all that stuff. None of that really matters if the light is bright. That is the biggest consideration. Samar Hartar at the National Institute of Mental Health, he's the head of the lab of chronobiology there. He's done experiments where it's the brightness of light. It's not blue light. So if you're getting a bright light between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m., you're dysregulating that internal clock. So without a strong circadian rhythm, your window of tolerance, right, that zone of regulation, it's going to be narrow, and you will be more prone to dysregulation. So this is the most important part of self-care. You will get your most bang for your buck. You will help your ability to stay self-regulated by setting your circadian clock, because you're going to have the energy that you need to deal with stress. You're going to have gas in your gas tank when you need it. And when you need to recover and rest, your brain is going to tell your body to be tired. And if you're in sync with that flow, you're going to be more likely to make good decisions. Hope this makes sense. So one of the consequences, and I've basically indirectly been talking about this the whole time, is the real consequence of circadian disruptions, what's called a late cortisol pulse. And this is a signature feature of depression, anxiety, and a lot of mental distress. And what happens is because our circadian rhythm is disrupted, instead of cortisol peaking in the morning, see that blue line, right? So you should wake up and have energy and feel agitated. And so cortisol is a stress hormone. And so it's agitating you into movement. Get out into the world, get going, get busy. And then throughout the day, it starts declining. And as it declines, melatonin comes up, and then we effortlessly fall into sleep. But what's happening instead is with the red line, looks like most of us, we start the day just bankrupt. We got nothing in the well-being account, negative assets, right? We're just very struggling to get going. So we take caffeine. Again, our worst habits are unskillful attempts to manage stress. We take caffeine to lift that line up to get to where we need to be. And then at night, when it's peaking, we take depressants to come back down. So again, circadian health is essential. And then other self-care deposits. I mean, we could talk about these, but they're no-brainers, right? We need good quality sleep. Practice good sleep hygiene. Take 30 minutes before you go to bed if you can, and do something relaxing to downregulate, whether it's reading kind of a mindless book, doing some stretching, doing some breathing. My book that's coming out soon, the Mindful Breathing Workbook for Teens, has a whole section helping teens create a good sleep hygiene and do breathing exercises to help calm down before going to bed. Getting enough physical activity, especially during the day, to help create fatigue at night. Just paying attention to your diet, right? Making sure that you're eating things that are nourishing and that give your body the energy it needs when it needs it, and doesn't tend to throw you into dysregulation. Maintaining social connection, which I know is hard given our current circumstances. And then just practicing mindfulness in general, calibrating the way we pay attention to the world, paying attention to how we pay attention, right? And sometimes we don't appreciate the impact that perpetually scattered attention has on our stress levels. And again, all of these, we could do a whole presentation on any of these. Okay, so now, as I said, there's kind of stress prevention, and then there's stress intervention. So we just went over stress prevention. What are the things we can do to stay ahead of stress in the first place? So make sure our well-being account has regular self-care deposits. And the biggest self-care deposit is balancing our circadian rhythm. The additional self-care deposits that help us stay in the positive in terms of our energy balance are the things we just talked about. Sleep, exercise, mindfulness, social connection. And so now we're looking at stress intervention. Once the dominoes of stress start falling, right? The neurobiology of stress is once that first domino goes, right? Once the adrenals start creating norepinephrine and we feel stress, now the dominoes are going. Now we're in the midst of a stressful state, and we have to develop skills to intervene in that state. And so that's what we're looking at here. Okay, so if we can be aware that we're starting to become stressed out, we can do something called cognitive reframing. And this is where we simply shift our perspective and free ourselves from a perspective we're holding on to in the moment that's causing us stress. A perfect example is the example I gave right before coming up here. I was getting stressed out, and then my wife said to me, aren't you giving a presentation on stress? Relax, right? And so her comment allows me to shift and reframe how I saw the situation. And in doing that, I was able to laugh at myself and be like, this is ridiculous. Yeah, you're right. And let it go. So that's cognitive reframing. In the mindfulness community, we talk about life is not the 3 Ps. Life is not personal, life is not permanent, and life is not perfect. And often it's our attachment to thinking life is about us, to thinking life should always stay the same, and thinking that life should always fulfill our expectations of it. It should be perfect. Holding on to those cognitive expectations often creates stress. And so it's important to realize if one of these is kind of your issue, if you tend to take things personally when they're not so personal, if you tend to want to make things stay the same, right, all the time, or if you tend to have really high expectations of how you think things should be. For me personally, it's the third one. That's the one that really consistently snags me, is I'll have expectations of how I think things should be. And when they're not that way, I start getting upset. So I tend to fall on that third P, right? So cognitive reframing is recognizing when we're taking things personally that are not about us and just saying to ourselves, reminding ourselves, hey, this has nothing to do with me. And in teaching, this is very important because we pour so much into it, we take things personally. And often when students aren't complying with what we want, we take it personally and it has nothing to do with us. And that's huge as an educator, is learning to not take it to heart, right? You just happen to be an innocent bystander in that given moment often, okay? So cognitive reframing can be a really useful tool. But if the stress dominoes are going too fast and we're already moving into lower brain, and our neocortex, our frontal lobe, our prefrontal cortex is totally offline, and we're really getting into those lower brain impulses, we lose the ability to cognitively reframe. And this is why when we're actually truly stressed out, someone saying to us, hey, calm down, it's like insulting, it doesn't work. And that's because our cognitive apparatus is gone, offline. So now we're really in the thick of a stressful state. And so we have to be able to control how we manage this state without relying on cognitive strategies. I often compare this to in flying, right? There's someone who's getting their pilot's license, right? So initially you learn to fly through vision. You get to see the terrain through the window, right? And that would be like cognitive reframing. But at some point, you're going to run into bad weather. You're going to fly into bad weather, and your visibility is not going to be there. You're going to need to fly by instrument. You're going to have to navigate the plane without actually being able to see. And that's this second form of intervention, is once we're in the clouds of stress and we can't see clearly anymore, we have to be able to manipulate the dials in front of us, so to speak. Hope that makes sense. I'm all about analogies, so sorry if I'm throwing too many out. So these interventions are controlling alertness and calm via vision, movement, and breathing. This is really important. Once the stress response is engaged, there are 3 direct interfaces we have with our nervous system, our autonomic nervous system: our vision, our eyes, our movement, and our breathing. These are 3 direct pathways we can use to downregulate autonomic arousal, sympathetic arousal, the sympathetic aspect of our nervous system. So let's start with vision. Again, I told you I was going to be throwing a lot of info. I want you guys leaving here with your heads spinning. So what a lot of people don't realize is that your eyes are your brain. Your eyes aren't connected to your brain. Your eyes are actually your brain. They're an extension of your brain. They're the only part of your brain that stands outside the skull. And originally, eyes had nothing to do with vision. Originally, they were for sensing light and dark, as we were just talking about, right? And over time, vision developed. And so what people don't realize is that what your eyes are doing, your internal state is doing, or your brain is doing. So your brain does what your eyes do. And you have 2 types of vision: foveal vision, which is your eyes narrowing in onto a particular point in space, and panoramic vision. This is where your eyes see a whole broad field at once. We are not made to be in foveal vision all the time. And we are, because of devices. We are constantly narrowed in on a small space, a small point in space. And when your eyes focus, that creates stress in the brain, right? Because your eyes are trying to look at and determine what's important and exclude other pieces of information. And it takes energy to do that. So this is why people talk about digital concussions, right? There's this phenomenon of the digital concussion. If you spend too much time on a computer or device, you start to develop symptoms that are analogous to having an actual head trauma concussion. And this is all driven by your eyes. Your eyes are not meant to focus. So too much focus increases sympathetic arousal, the part of your nervous system responsible for fight or flight. And so if you're constantly narrowing your eyes, your brain is producing a background level of stress hormones constantly. And so you can notice the more time you spend on a screen, the more irritable you kind of become. So things you can do are take eye breaks. Like right now, I'm set up, I'm on my second floor. I have an office on the second floor of my house. I have 2 wonderful windows here that look out, backyard, trees. And as I'm often doing work now in quarantine and remote learning, I'm able to take a break, look out, and just scan out and view out. And what this does is it calms sympathetic arousal down. So throughout the day, pay attention to what your eyes are doing. If your eyes are focusing too much, you're going to be stressed out. And if you want to be calm before you go to bed, don't have your eyes be narrowing in on things, which can be a problem with reading, right? Because reading is narrowing, but it's not quite as irritating as being on an actual screen and looking at a phone. Okay. Movement. I mean, this is simple. This is a no-brainer. Stress is designed to make you move. I mean, that's what it does. When those stress hormones flood your body and you feel horrible in your own skin, it's designed to agitate you into movement. Why? Because your stress response is supposed to help you survive, and movement has helped you survive. So movement downregulates stress initiating areas of the brain. When you move, you tell your brain, we got it, we're on it. We're either fighting it or we're getting away from it, and you don't need to keep sending out the alarm signal. Movement also clears stress hormones from the system faster. So you have that influx of norepinephrine and your heart rate elevates and you're agitated and you're in lower brain and all that's circulating in your body, if you get up and go for a walk and move, that stuff's going to cycle through your system faster than if you just sit there and it just lingers in your blood and in your tissue. You're also going to get that kind of stress hangover if you don't move. So movement burns those things up and puts you in a better place. Movement itself is a stressor that creates fitness, and fitness makes you more tolerant of stress. So the more you move, you can build up base level fitness. And when you have a base level of fitness, you can handle stress more effectively, whether it's psychological or physical. This is why exercise, the research on exercise and mental health is extensive. Breathing. I could ramble on about breathing forever. My new book is on it, but here's just the quick summary. Emotion and respiration are linked in the brain. It's a bidirectional relationship, which means, so at every moment, how you're breathing is a reflection of your emotional arousal level. So you're breathing in accordance with your emotional RPMs, okay? But it's a bidirectional relationship, meaning you can, like if I were to say to you right now, slow your breathing down and breathe through your nose. By changing the rate of your breathing, you can then work backwards and downregulate your emotions. We're the only thing on planet Earth that can consciously control respiration. It's pretty cool. We're the only things that can leverage our breathing to modulate our internal state. And here's the beauty of it. You're going to breathe 20 to 30,000 times today. It's never at a distance from you. You're always already doing it. It is the easiest stress management strategy because you can't always move. And if you're in a meeting and you're trying to look in panoramic vision, or you're stuck in an office and you can't see outside, right? But you're always breathing. So you can always manipulate your breathing. You have this wonderful muscle called the diaphragm muscle that goes through the center of your body. It's an umbrella-shaped muscle. It's the pump or the suction that gets air to come into your lungs and out. You have a nerve called the phrenic nerve tied from your diaphragm to your brain. The phrenic nerve, phren comes from the Greek. It means mind. Brilliant, whoever named this, right? So the phrenic nerve is how your breathing tells your brain about the status of your body. And so when you slow your breathing down, you can consciously control your diaphragm by slowing your breathing down. And then it ties the phrenic nerve, those signals from the diaphragm to the brain get slow. And then your brain says, oh, okay, I can calm down, right? Human body is amazing, absolutely amazing. Stress and carbon dioxide intolerance. I'm going to skip this because it's too big to talk about here, and I'm quickly running out of time. 2 recommendations for breathing. I do seminars on breathing all the time, but these are just the 2 simplest recommendations. Shut your mouth. Breathe through your nose. Chronic mouth breathing is a sign of emotional dysregulation. One of the things I've repeatedly done with students is I will look for mouth breathers, and I will account for people who have allergies or colds or whatever, or some explanation of why they might be for a particular period of time breathing through their mouth. But if I find a student who is chronically breathing through their mouth, I will always follow up about just, hey, how you doing? Are you stressed out? Are things going on? And about almost 100% of the time, with a little bit of follow-up, a little bit of questioning, we find that there are some issues going on with that student. The breath doesn't lie. And if you start becoming attuned to how people breathe, you can start to read emotion dysregulation in their respiration. And with students, this can be invaluable. So shut your mouth, breathe through your nose. Breathing through your nose helps maintain emotion regulation. Breathe light, breathe slow, breathe deep. Helps calm you down. Okay. This is an aside. I've done 2-day workshops on just this, narrative identity. Basically, narrative identity is the story we tell ourselves about ourselves. And I almost hesitate to go over this now. I threw it in at the last second because it doesn't fit neatly into preventative strategies or stress interventions. It could fall into both, arguably, but narrative identity is just our story. And what people don't realize is often the biggest cause of stress is your story, the narrative you have running in the back of your head about why things are the way that they are. And to quote or to paraphrase Albert Bandura, who's a researcher at Stanford, 90 some years old, and he's still researching and writing books. You cannot outperform your story. You will go no farther than your story will allow you. And so if you have a maladaptive, self-defeating, negativity biased story, then that's what you're going to continue to get. And it's because we don't see things as they are. We see things as we are, and we are our stories. And if our stories are not helpful, we're just going to project that onto the world. And so it's so important as a teacher to identify students who are developing unhealthy narratives, academic narratives about what they're capable of as a student, but also just emotional narratives, what kind of stress they can tolerate and how much. You know, having students who say, I can't deal with this, I can't deal with this. Well, that's a story. And maybe in that moment you can't, right? Maybe the moment that kid can't deal with it, but you still need to follow up and look at the narrative there behind, I can't deal with this, right? There's a story there. So narrative identity is, when we're talking about stress management and transforming stress into skill, this is something that has to absolutely be addressed for both adults and young adults. And often young adults will adopt the narratives of the adults around them, which is huge, right? So be careful of the story you're playing out as a parent, as a coach, as a teacher, because there are little ones who are absorbing it all around you. Okay. Got 13 minutes left. A few quick thoughts on COVID-19. I had to put this in here because it's the elephant in the room. The ultimate stress recipe. If we were to cook up the ultimate stress recipe, what are the things that research shows will just stress the hell out of people? It's an imminent threat to their safety, whether it be psychological or physical. It's giving people a sense of lack of control of what's happening around them, so stealing their agency. It's providing a perception of things worsening. They've done studies at dentists' office where it's the same procedure for the same amount of time. One group, they told how long it was going to last. The other, they didn't. The group they told how long it would last reported when it was done, it was no big deal. Some even said it was pleasurable. The group that was not given a time frame was had a much different assessment. They negatively assessed it. They thought it was painful. They thought it was uncomfortable. We want to know how long things are going to last. So an indeterminate time frame stresses people out. And so COVID, I'll stop there for a second. COVID is all of these things so far. It's an imminent threat. It's beyond our control. It's so widespread. We're tethered to the news for our information, and the news thrives off of scaring the hell out of us. So we have this constant perception of things worsening. So modify your news intake. I'll just say that. We have an indeterminate time frame. We don't know when this is going to end. And then there's this disruption of what's called serial processing. Serial processing is the brain's ability to automate everyday behaviors. Things like brushing your teeth. Things like just basic everyday things, right? Your brain doesn't have to spend the energy of conscious thought doing them. So it's going to automate it. Well, with COVID, suddenly we have to think about everything. Do I have to wear a mask? Should I wear a mask? What do I do with the mask? Do I wear gloves? Do I put the mask off here? Do I wash my hands now? Do I go to the grocery store? Should I go to the grocery store at the beginning because then fewer people had been there, right? We have to ask all these questions and think through our day in a way that's creating stress. It's elevating vigilance in the brain. And then last, social isolation, right? One of the best cures for stress is social connection, especially for children and young adults, right? Being emotionally and socially regarded by an adult is a great way of restoring regulation. Well, now direct contact and proximity is a threat. And so COVID it's the perfect stress recipe, right? Any situation with any one of these would be stressful. COVID is the perfect storm. It's all of them at once. And so the consequences of this is, for many people, they're putting their life on hold and they're waiting for normal to return. And one thing we know is that living in a holding pattern or living off your heels, so to speak, makes us less resilient. That and there's actually a neurobiological explanation for this. When we act on our reality, when we're moving forward purposely and productively, we're more resilient to stress. And this has to do with dopamine, the neurotransmitter. Dopamine actually blunts the effect of norepinephrine, which is a stress hormone that makes us quit. So when we're pursuing valuable goals, maybe we can't plan things out a year like we could before, but we still can plan goals out a month from now or at the end of the week, and then work backwards and say, today I need to accomplish X, Y, and Z, right? And as long as we're identifying those benchmarks and we're moving towards them, valuable accomplishments, we're going to be creating dopamine. We're going to be creating that positive reward for moving forward in life and being engaged, actively engaged on our reality. And what this does is it allows us to tolerate more stress. And when you take that away because you're living on hold, you actually become more susceptible to stress and quitting. And this is a big one, allowing temporary lifestyle adjustments to become permanent lifestyle habits. When COVID started, it was like, how long is this going to last? I'll wake up and spend the day in my pajamas because it feels good. And now it's 6-7 months later. Are you still waking up in your pajamas? Right? So we made these temporary things, adjustments, because we didn't know how long it would last. But some of us, it wasn't temporary. We're still doing it and it's become permanent. So these are things we need to look out for. Continue to make meaningful goals, continue to act productively and proactively on reality, and make sure you're not adopting behaviors that aren't helpful. So let's put all the pieces together. I got 7 minutes left. I hope your heads are spinning. Mine's spinning. Okay, putting the pieces together. Practical tips and considerations. The best is the enemy of the good. I just threw so much at you. Often people create this idea when they're talking about change and making changes in their life. They create this idea of what everything would, how everything would be perfect. And then quickly, 2 days later, they realize they can't maintain this idea of perfection. So they quit. The best is the enemy of the good. Don't try to change everything at once. Pick one thing. Start small. Momentum is everything. I always say to students, think of the amount of energy that goes into moving a freight train that first inch. Getting all those cars, all that metal and steel moving 1 inch. But once you've moved that 1 inch, now you got momentum. Now you're moving. And movement has momentum. And it makes subsequent movement easier. Start small, build momentum. Don't create this idea of everything you're going to change at once and then quit. Ask yourself, what's your lifestyle trajectory, right? What are your current... Your habits are your life outcomes are the sum total of your lifestyle habits. You are your habits. And so what trajectory are your lifestyle habits on? Are they pointing you towards baseline and you're just maintaining? Are they pointing you in a positive trajectory so that you're building towards something better? Or are your habits pointed downward? And you're kind of in this slow or quick slide into maladaptive behaviors. And then last, think about beginnings and endings. As a teacher, this is just so powerful. How things begin and how they end determines and sets the tone for everything that happens in between. Let me say that again. How things begin and how they end shapes and colors what happens in between. So if you start your day calibrating the type of mindset that you want, and you end your day consciously reflecting on the person you were throughout the day, you're creating these bookends. And when you do that day in and day out, everything in between is going to be elevated. And you can break this into a teacher, the beginning of a period and the end of the period. Create something positive. Students then will perceive that everything that happened in between was more positive. The beginning and ending of a week, the beginning and ending of a semester, the beginning and ending of a year. These are all opportune moments to infuse life with positivity and productivity, etc. Implications for education. Oh, I forgot about this. Woo! We got a couple minutes. More than with any instructional content, you teach with who and how you are, right? Who you are in the classroom is the most important thing, okay? Christian Huygens, who invented the pendulum clock, found that if you put multiple pendulum clocks on the same wall, they all sync to the same cadence. This is a wonderful analogy for the person of influence in any situation sets the emotional tone. If you're a teacher, you're a coach, you're a parent, you're an educational leader, you're setting the emotional tone for everyone else. Everyone else is syncing to your pendulum, your cadence. Be aware of that, right? You teach with who you are and how you are. Teaching is difficult. It's the perfect recipe for stress. We care a lot. We have so much heart involved in what we do, and yet so much of what happens is outside of our control. And this makes us susceptible to viral negativity. Stress erodes our psychological immune system. And I see this happen all the time. Teachers get run down. They get tired. They get stressed out. They're not putting self-care deposits in their well-being account, and they get infected with viral negativity, and it sweeps through a building. And unfortunately, it might go on. It might become a permanent feature of a school culture that goes on for years, right? So you got to be very careful. This is why teachers need to practice self-care so they don't get infected with viral negativity. In conclusion, I got to skip this. The greatest power that we have is the ability, the greatest power that we have is the ability to consciously direct our own adaptation. This makes human beings unique. We can choose how we develop. Not entirely, but we have some choice, right? There are other factors, but the more we can exercise this power to choose, the more we can control the adaptations that we want. Through skillful engagement with stress, you can create positive adaptations and live the life that you want to live. And so I leave you back with the two doors at the beginning. Door number 1 and door number 2. In light of everything we've just talked about, I leave you with the question, which door will you open? Which life will you live? We all want life, the life behind door number 1. Too many of us are living the life behind door number 2. Let's do something about it. If you're behind door number 2, maybe it's for a couple weeks you've been there, maybe months, maybe years. It doesn't matter. There's always a way back. And employing some of the strategies that we've talked about today will hopefully be a way of finding your way back to door number 1. Thank you for listening. The end. Feel free to send me an email if you have any questions or comments. Feel free to join me on Instagram or LinkedIn. And that's it.